Good afternoon and good evening to those in Europe, and maybe good middle of the night to people in other parts of the world. My name is Dick Morningstar. I'm the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm speaking to you today from Presque Isle, Maine, which is about 2 miles from the closed Canadian border, in a hotel room with a Zoom connection, which I think will stay healthy, hopefully. And I want to thank you for joining us today for this timely discussion on the role of oil and natural gas in a net zero world, and maybe even more particularly, the role for international energy companies such as Equinor. If we're going to reach net zero, there is no question that there's going to have to be a public-private partnership with international energy companies to accomplish this by 2050 and to work on a timely basis. I'm particularly excited today because I get to introduce my good friend, Al Cook, who is the Executive Vice President for Exploration and International Production at Equinor. Al and I became good friends, and our families became good friends when I was our ambassador in Baku. And Al was then a BP vice president and responsible for the Shah Deniz project, which is now beginning to ship gas through the southern gas corridor, and certainly to Turkey now, and by the end of this year, on into Europe. Al has now moved on to this extremely senior position at Equinor, and is right in the middle of Equinor's work to achieve net zero and to do all it can to work on a clean environment. Al is going to speak give keynote remarks for a few minutes. Then he will join a panel that will include Juliana Garazar, who's the Vice President of Innovation at Greentown Labs, and Greg Charineau, who's the Portfolio Manager for Real Assets at PIMCO. The panel will be moderated by another good friend, Halima Croft, who is the Global and Managing Head for Commodity Markets at RBC Capital. And as far as the Atlantic Council is concerned, even more important, a good friend of the Global Energy Center on our board of directors and executive committee. Halima will moderate the discussion. Just a few notes that I need to mention before turning it over to Al. Today's event is recorded and on the record. And then to participate in the Q&A session, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. I encourage all of you to engage about today's discussion over Twitter using the hashtag ACEnergy, and also to follow us on hashtag AC Global Energy. And also, I guess that's all that I need to tell you, other than to remind you that this is on the record. And with that, I will turn it over to my very good friend, Al, who will give his keynote remarks. Over to you, Al.
Thanks, Dick. And it's just great to be here back at the Atlantic Council with old friends. And it's great to be here in Washington, D.C. And it's great to be here in the United States. I was last in the US in March last year, just as the pandemic was hitting the shores. And at that point, I had no idea it would be 15 months before I could return to the United States. And the fact that I'm here in DC, the fact that we have a live audience of a grand total, I believe, of 10 people live, is, I hope, a sign of a return towards normality. But when we talk about a return towards normality, we don't mean a return to March 2020. The normality to which we'll return is very different. And there's been a permanent change. And the fact that this discussion today is happening with panelists who are sitting everywhere from the northeast of the northeast of the US in Maine and the southwest of the US in California, and the fact that we have an audience who's able to connect globally, I think is another sign of the permanent change. And of course, the oil and gas industry, the energy industry, is just as much affected by that permanent change as broader society. And two words, I think, symbolize the permanent change for the energy industry more than anything else. And those two words are net zero. You'll see them in the title of the session today. The Biden administration has come forward with its target of reaching net zero by 2050. It's just the latest government to do that. And as an energy company with its own target of net zero by 2050, we greatly welcome that and see that as a tipping point for a lot of the world as they see the position that the US government has taken. As we head towards COP26 in Glasgow, net zero is the clear standard by which companies and countries will be measured going forward. The question is what are the actions that we take to get there, and what's the role of our energy industry in getting to that point? But the permanent change for the oil and gas industry is not just driven by climate change, it's also driven by economics. The negative oil prices that we saw in West Texas Intermediate oil prices we saw last year are a sign of how fragile the oil price can be and how connected the oil price is to demand, a salient reminder for all of us. And the fact that the only energy source to grow during the course of 2020 was renewable energy is also a salient reminder of the permanent change that is coming upon us. So what does this mean for a company like the one I work for, Equinor, formerly known as Statoil, set up 49 years ago to develop oil and gas in Norway? What does this change mean for the oil and gas industry in general? And what does this change mean for a world that demands more energy, yet also requires fewer emissions? I'd like to start with a reminder that as I speak today, 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. It's easy to forget that amongst all the attention that renewable energy gets these days. That 80% will fall and must fall, but oil and gas demand will be around for decades. To the frustration of many, oil and gas demand is growing at the moment by close on record amounts. And it's becoming evident that oil and gas demand will almost certainly grow through the 2020s. There's a stark contrast between ambitions on the one hand and reality on the other hand. Nowhere is that contrast marked as starkly as in the recent report by the International Energy Agency, the IEA. That set out that in order for the world to achieve net zero, there should be no new oil and gas projects after 2021. It set out a massive increase in nuclear fission as a source of energy. It set out the sacrifices that we would all need to make. If you want your house heated, you can heat it up to 19 degrees centigrade, but no more. If you want your house cooled, you can cool it down to 25 degrees centigrade, but no more. And as we look at those, it's fairly obvious that those policies are not in line with the agenda of any government anywhere around the world. For me, this is a tale of two 50s. The first 50 is the 50% decline in greenhouse gas emissions that the world needs to see if we're going to get to 2050. So we need to see a decline of around about 50% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The second 50% is the number of people who lack access to electricity, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries like Mali, Ethiopia, and Sudan. So what do we in the oil and gas industry need to do about this? What's the contribution we can make? I believe that there are three big differences we can make as we acknowledge the permanent change that the world is seeing. The first is that for as long as the world demands oil and gas, we should produce it with the fewest emissions possible. Not every barrel of oil, not every cubic foot of gas is born equal. At the moment, globally, on average, if we produce a barrel of oil, that takes around about 17 to 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide. That emits around about 17 to 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide. We in Equinor have targeted to bring that down, and as of today, if we produce a barrel of oil, we emit 8 kilograms. Now, that's not perfect. 0 would be perfect, but there's a huge difference between 17 to 18, the global average, and what we're able to achieve. We are, as a company, beyond our own peak emissions as a result. And we intend to bring that 8 kilograms down further. And 2 weeks ago, we set out and we went out in front of the capital markets and we set out our targets for 2030, 2035, all leading to net zero by 2050. How do we do this? How do we produce oil and gas with a lower carbon footprint? And in our case, it's by deploying technology that we've developed in Norway over the last half century. So back in the 1970s, the Norwegian continental shelf developed as an oil and gas province. And we were able to show that you can develop a whole oil and gas province without any routine flaring of gas. Routine flaring of gas is one of the worst contributors of our industry towards climate change. In the 1990s, we showed that we could use carbon capture and storage on an industrial scale as we set that up, captured emissions from our Sleipner and Snøhvit fields in the Norwegian North Sea and buried those safely under the ground. And in the 2010s, we showed that we could electrify the operations that we have offshore, dramatically reducing the emissions associated with the production of oil and gas and culminating in our flagship Johan Sverdrup development, which now has emissions of less than a kilogram of carbon dioxide per barrel of oil produced. So 1/17 of the global average. We've made a pledge that everywhere we operate as an oil and gas company, we will work with the host country to reduce their carbon emissions intensity. And everywhere we partner, everywhere we invest at all, we will work with our operators, with our partners to produce and proactively bring forward know-how on low carbon. What does this mean in practice? It means that if you go down to Brazil, we just took a final investment decision on our giant Bacalhau flagship project down there in the Brazilian Atlantic. And we put on their carbon capture, we put on their CCGT technology. That's a technology that you only normally find in power stations onshore, but we've brought that offshore to dramatically reduce carbon emissions. In Azerbaijan, we're working with our operator there to bring down energy usage associated with pumps, and that's had a remarkable effect, bringing down energy usage on the platforms offshore there. And one of the reasons I'm in the United States this week is to hear more and push more for the emissions reductions that we have associated with our businesses here. And we're working with really good companies in the US like Southwestern and Chesapeake in order to drive down the emissions on our joint operations in places like the Appalachian. And what you'll see here is we will do work ourselves, but we will also work through others. And we think this is really important. We should remember that 90% of the world's oil and gas reserves are owned by national oil companies, well outside the normal scrutiny and the carbon taxes and the regulatory policies that we see in the US and in Europe, and well outside the knowledge of most of the consumers and most of those who are concerned about climate change. So working and punching above our weight to influence the industry in general, I believe, is absolutely key. But it's not enough simply to reduce the emissions associated with the oil and gas we produce, which brings me on to the second of the 3 points. And that is that we need to take the revenues that we're getting from oil and gas and deploy those into renewable energy. And if I'm right, the oil and gas prices and demand will stay high and even rise through the 2020s, then that is a unique opportunity to take those revenues and invest it for the future. We need to bring our skills and our experience we've developed as an industry in global scale, world-class project management, in how we manage energy trading, in how we do offshore operations, in managing geopolitical risk around the world. We need to bring all of those skills and deploy them into renewable energy. It's almost 20 years since we in Equinor embarked upon this journey, and we've chosen to focus on offshore wind. It's where we believe that we have the most to add. It's where we believe there's the most similarity with offshore oil and gas. We started 20 years ago in the UK and in Germany. And as I speak today, we're constructing the world's largest offshore wind farm. It's called Dogger Bank, and it's off the UK coastline in the North Sea. And tomorrow I plan to see for myself our operations that we plan in New York, offshore New York, where we're building a project there called Empire Wind, which will be one of the largest wind farms of its kind in the US. By the way, it takes a Norwegian company to come to the US and call its wind project Empire Wind. As a Brit, I would have balked at that particular choice of name. We're doing that, and we'll also pair it up with a less controversially named project called Beacon Wind. And together, those two projects will produce 4.5 gigawatts of power by 2030, which represents about 15% of the target that President Biden's administration has set for 2030. So a meaningful contribution and a big step on the way to bringing offshore wind power at scale in the United States. And even more excitingly, as I speak, we're developing floating offshore wind, and this will open up vast areas of hitherto inaccessible coastline to offshore wind. And we're really excited about the possibility of deploying that in California, where the coastline really drops off fast. And at the moment, we've got a wind farm operational in the North Sea, offshore Scotland, and we're building another one in Norway. And this floating technology, we believe, is absolutely key to unlocking the next stage of floating wind. So if those are the first two things, what's the third thing we need to do? And that is to recognize that for the foreseeable future, renewable energy cannot meet all the demands that we have. And in particular, we have two problems of renewable energy. One, intensity, and two, intermittency. We simply can't get from renewable energy, be it solar, or be it wind, or be it wave or tidal, we cannot get the intensity of heat required for processes like steel or cement manufacturing, and we cannot get the reliability that we require to run an economy where people can't afford to be without power, and where batteries haven't yet made the technological advances to provide that capacity when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. And we believe that the prime way of addressing this is through clean hydrogen. As a company, we're investing in Europe's largest blue hydrogen project. That's hydrogen that comes from natural gas, and Europe's largest green hydrogen project. That's hydrogen fed by renewable power that is created through the electrolysis of water. At the moment, we see blue hydrogen providing 95% of the climate benefit, of the emissions benefit of green hydrogen for about 1/3 of the price. So 95% of the benefit for about 1/3 of the price. So we're putting most of our capital at the moment into blue hydrogen. We're leading a project called Zero Carbon Humber, which at the moment is the world's largest blue hydrogen project. And that's looking at decarbonizing an industrial cluster, the UK's largest industrial cluster in northeast England. We're very pleased to get backing for that, financial backing and moral backing from the UK government, and that project is now moving forward. And this is really important for a jobs agenda as well. For all that renewable energy can bring forward green jobs, it's vitally important that we also protect jobs that have been created around steel, around cement, around heavy industry, and we protect that by decarbonizing those industries rather than eliminating them. And one of the other reasons that brings me to the United States this week is that we hope to bring this technology, this blue hydrogen technology, from the northeast of the UK to the northeast of the US, and in particular to the tri-state region of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And we intend to be announcing a series of projects over the next few days and weeks. Please take a look out for those announcements. And we intend to bring clean molecules to the northeast of the United States to join up with the clean electrons that we'll be bringing from our offshore wind projects. And the driver for my visit is what Ambassador Morningstar referred to, and that is the need for this incredible collaboration between government, consumers, and upstream investors if we're going to make this a success. We need regulatory support, we need permitting support, we need streamlining of processes, we need legislative support in order to bring blue hydrogen to the United States. So what is the role of the oil and gas industry in achieving net zero? Firstly, we need to acknowledge that the world is going to demand oil and gas for decades to come. So it really, really matters how we produce it, and it really matters that we reduce emissions associated with it as much as possible. The second thing we need to do as an industry is take all of that resource we have, be it capital resource, the revenues we're getting from oil and gas, all of the thousands and thousands of people with incredible technical skills in the oil and gas industry, and begin the redeployment of that capital and those people into renewable energy. And the third thing we need to do is to recognize that for a long time to come, renewable energy will not meet all of humanity's needs. So we need to work not just to decarbonize our own emissions, but to decarbonize our consumers' emissions through the provision of clean hydrogen. So hopefully that's given the panel a little bit of food for thought, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm Halima Croft, Head of Commodity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets, and I'm now going to moderate a panel discussion picking up on many of the themes that Al just laid out. And I would like to tell all the viewers, if you would like to submit a question, please do so, and I will try to get to as many as I can, but we only have a short amount of time. So Al and my fellow panelists, I want to ask you a little bit more about this IEA report. I mean, it was a blockbuster report, got a lot of press attention. We had, one oil minister call it sort of la la land in terms of the recommendations that were really made, in terms of the incredible changes that companies, individuals, and governments will need to make to reach these net zero goals. Now, Al, you've talked about how difficult it will be to achieve any of these goals, but when you look at that IEA report, what do you take from it that you actually think is doable, which is necessary, which your company is going to focus on?
So I think it was overall an important report. And in a sense, we've had too many reports for too long that have underestimated the importance of renewables. And if this report swings the pendulum over to the other side, then that will enable us to get a healthy balance overall. Fatih Birol himself, the author of the report, talked last week about his frustration about the difference between rhetoric and reality. And I think what this report does, perhaps more than anything, is emphasize that we can't wait until 2050 to achieve these targets. We have to start today. Every new project that we do has to be aligned with a goal of net zero. That, to me, is the key thing that comes out of this report.
So Juliana, I want to bring you into the conversation because you're really at the forefront of a lot of these sort of innovation conversations. And when you think about that IEA report, I mean, what do you think is the most critical technology that we need to focus on to reach these net zero goals? And do you think we have sufficient investment going into those technologies at the moment?
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about Greentown Labs before I elaborate on the answers. I'm Juliana Greiser. I'm the head of the Houston incubator for Greentown Labs. Greentown Labs is the biggest climate tech incubator in the US. We have a campus of 3 buildings in Boston, Massachusetts, and now we just opened on Earth Day, a 4th building in Houston. So that was our first out-of-state expansion. I'm pretty sure it won't be the last. And why we decided to expand to Houston, first of all, is the energy capital of the world. And, many of our partners, of course, many of which are big oil and gas companies, have a strong presence there, but also because the mayor of Houston asked us to expand into Houston. He really thought we could be the catalyst for the energy transition in Houston. And we've seen a big shift in many of the oil and gas majors who are in Houston in terms of how they're tackling the energy transition and the sense of urgency. Basically putting a Greentown Labs in Houston in such a short period of time, in less than a year and a half, is a testament to that sense of urgency. So what we do is pretty simple. We are an incubator for anything that is climate tech. So it's not only about new energies, but also about decarbonizing the other sectors that are the most greenhouse gas emitting, like construction, ag tech and water, anything that has to do with transportation. And then, of course, anything that has to do with robotics and IoT, all those platforms that we need for traceability, as well as carbon capture. So we have been incubating more than 380 companies for 10 years in Boston now. And now we have 41 companies that we are incubating here in this new Houston operation that we have. And I have to say that, the sense of urgency is really there. People really believe that, in order to fulfill all of these net zero, pledges that many of the oil and gas companies, many companies, tech companies like Microsoft and Intel, who are also founding partners and ground-up partners of Greentown Houston, want to achieve, we need a huge step up in terms of technologies and investing in the right technologies. And that's where we come in. We are trying to catalyze that as soon as possible. Many of our companies, I think the big goal is to get them connected with big corporations as soon as possible. That's what we've been doing successfully for 10 years. With some of the companies we've been working for so long, like Shell or Chevron, we even have created specific corporate acceleration programs for them to really fulfill very narrow challenges that they have. So we kind of have a little bit outsourced some of the innovation that they require to us, because after working for a while with us, they realize that, a lot of the technical challenges they have might be solved in a faster way if they actually come to us. So we've done 11 corporate led acceleration programs so far, one actually in offshore wind with Vineyard Wind. They had this very specific challenge to use technologies to detect marine life in the offshore rigs. And we really are trying to fast track all this innovation to these big companies that really have very important pledges to fulfill. And one of the big issues here is also not only connecting them with these corporations, but also make sure that they have the right capital, right? And that's one of the key questions that you're asking. We really believe that, we've seen a lot of inbound requests from, new funds that have been created. A lot of the oil and gas private equity funds here in Houston are themselves transitioning. We can see a lot of corporate venture capital that, are renaming themselves like Total for Low Carbon Ventures and many others. So we really believe there's quite a lot of inflow of new capital coming into Houston and into all the places that have climate tech. It's more about having the companies investment ready. So I think the inflow of capital doesn't match the technology generation. And we really feel that we need to make sure we get more technology out there. So we are really, in Houston at least, working a lot with the universities to make sure that all the technologies, all the IP, gets into commercialization stage as soon as possible, to make sure that everybody who's studying anything related to decarbonization gets to come to Greentown Lab to test their products. And also in Houston, we have a huge oil and gas workforce that wants to transition. And one of the things we've taken on in Houston as Greentown Labs is also make sure we do the proper signposting to get all these workforce into the other side of the energy transition. So many of them are, not only getting trained, but also getting a lot of internships with some of our companies. And, it's pretty funny to see that for Greentown Labs, the website, greentownlabs.com, the page that is the most visited, of course, is the careers one. We have our members that are hiring nonstop. We have more than 100 job postings, and that really signifies that things are changing at a very fast pace. But, we need to be aware of the bubble that might be created. There's a lot of money coming in, and some of it, investors have not been educated into investing in energy transition. So not everybody will be a winner going forward.
Thank you so much. And Greg, I want to turn to you now, because you really are one of the most sophisticated energy investors out there. And I want to ask you how you think about this IEA report, and more generally, how do you think these ESG mandates are going to evolve?
Thank you for that compliment, first of all. I think the IEA report was very important as a signal and a wake-up call for investors as well as policymakers. And the two of us ultimately need to swim in the same direction as with the innovators and the corporates. So I think in that standpoint, the IEA report, while maybe not La La Land, but somewhere an aspiration. And I think that's something we have to all work together. So from an investor standpoint, that's working with the companies, that's educating them on what we're able to and willing to invest in, encouraging better policies, but also working as an advocate with the companies to advocate for better policy of the governance, whether it be carbon prices, whether it be disclosure. And this is where our investors play an important role. And I do believe that the last comments about it's going to be hard to make money in the energy transition is very important. We've seen a lot of different investment cycles in the energy space that have gone well and subsequently gone poorly. So I think it's going to require, in my mind, one of the most important things is a solid policy backdrop. I think it's one of the things, if there's administrators on here and there's policymakers, that clarity and that certainty, I think, would go a long way in fostering some greater steps to making the IEA goal and our societal goals more likely to come true than not.
Greg, I want to pick up on that point, because I think it's so important, and this is the Atlantic Council. This is the right forum to address these questions. I mean, what is the sort of enabling policy environment that needs to happen? I mean, where's the role for a carbon price? And this is something I want to ask, all three panelists. But if we could think about the policy backdrop, like what is required to reach these net zero goals?
Well, carbon prices and complementary policies are two important steps, because you're basically directly attacking or directly expensing the carbon emissions. And what we're trying to directly address is that. So the problem you have is that it's one that is often regressive in nature. So when you look at different policy recommendations that have a redistribution component to it, for example, that's a positive force. And when you look at what happened in California last year, the redistribution nature of the carbon program was really one of the things that made it sacrosanct. Like, there wasn't a concern about should we eliminate the program because there's economic problems. They were like, well, let's see what we could use from the revenues to help redistribute and help people who are in desperate need. And I think, like, in a lot of respects, these carbon policies could be a very, very positive tool for putting in the right policy frameworks to allow companies like Equinor to do the right type of investments that could really get us going down the path that we want to go. So I think that's one of the, in our minds, I think that's a very important way of achieving the ends.
Al, can I bring you in on this? I mean, what is when you think about the sort of enabling environment, when you think about your interactions with the various governments that you deal with, what are your asks in terms of the policy environment to help drive these goals?
Well, I'd start by agreeing with Greg that, in an ideal world, we would want a global carbon tax. We've had a carbon tax in Norway for a long time. In fact, today it's getting towards $100 a ton. And that means that everything you do is focused on reducing those emissions. It's in our financial interests as well as in our environmental interests. I would point to three things. I think, first of all, the more consistency we can have internationally, the better. It's a strange world when you can make huge investments in climate technology in one country, but not in another, and there's only one atmosphere up there. I think the second thing is consistency over time. Energy projects take a long time to develop. We joke that we change our toothbrush every 3 months, we change our mobile phone every 3 years, we change our energy systems every 30 years. So we need longer term policies. And then thirdly, we need a streamlining of the permits and the regulations that stop us moving forward at pace with renewables and with low carbon hydrogen. And in some ways, the regulatory environment has not yet caught up with the pace of the energy transition.
Juliana, could I bring you in as well in terms of what would be your policy ask to drive these net zero goals?
Yeah, so of course, carbon pricing and internationally or global carbon pricing is one that would make a lot of sense. Being in Texas, that means it might take a while to get there, but one that I see as a low hanging fruit, at least here, is anything that has to do with resilience. And I think, more and more in many areas of the US, we're having huge catastrophes, huge climate catastrophes, in Houston specifically, with not only the winter storm that, get us without power for at least 3 days. A lot of people died or were in very dire situations. And I think that's something that, cannot happen in a developed country like the US. Same thing with the wildfires in California. I think everything needs to be thought through the lens of how you can survive these extreme weather conditions. And, at least it's pretty clear that the grid here in Texas is not, that we need to follow ways to not only winterize the grid, but also make it more resilient. Same thing with anything that has to do with flooding in Houston. I think, we're gonna see more and more of these 1,000-year storms that, happen to happen almost every year right now. And I think, there needs to be policies developed to create more resilient and more autonomous systems in order to survive and not become climate refugees.
Excellent. And I'm not getting a ton of questions in, and I have so many I could ask myself, but I want to actually start bringing the audience questions in. And we're actually getting multiple questions on sort of two key themes. First of all, the issue about energy access and about the sort of millions of people on continents like Sub-Saharan Africa that are using biomass to heat their homes. They don't have stable electricity supplies. How do we ensure that these energy access issues get the attention necessary at big forums? Is there not sufficient attention made, when these countries are saying that maybe we can't move to 100% renewables, we need natural gas? Like, how do we think about the energy mix for those countries? And then the second bucket of questions I'm getting a lot on is, if you are an oil and gas producer in Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, and if you look at the IEA report, or even the really ambitious net zero goals laid out by many European governments and Western governments, what happens if you're in Nigeria or Venezuela? How do you prepare to, transition yourself? So those are the two questions. If we could, maybe pick one, pick both, but we're getting a lot of questions on how we deal with both energy access and how we deal with countries, the hydrocarbon producers, how are they going to make the transition? So Juliana, I've got you on. Do you want to start with that, and then we'll move down the line?
Yeah, so for many of these less developed countries, one of the biggest things is that, there's no infrastructure, to attach to the grid. There's no infrastructure for many of the things. So, I don't think there's going to be a point where we're going to catch up to that. We need to be smarter than that and think about new business models to make sure that we make up for the lack of infrastructure. So I think those are the ones that have been like the kind of innovations that are working better in the least developed countries. And I can see, companies that are doing, are doing great, for example, in places like Latin America, when they do their own microgrids or micro solar panels. And of course, because the individuals cannot pay to have a solar panel installed, they do like a solar panel as a service, so they install the solar panel and they pay for the fees they get used, and over the time, the solar panel will get paid. So I think we need to become much more innovative in the way we do business. Things get paid, and I think we did a great job when, we use the SaaS model for anything that has to do with software through Silicon Valley. That was a huge boom. I think we need to use the SaaS model, or, the energy services as a model for the countries that are lacking the infrastructure, so that somehow with these micropayments, people can get to have access to cleaner energy, to safer energy, and can actually bridge the wealth gap.
Al, can I turn to you now with this. I mean, Ecuador has a significant presence in sub-Saharan Africa. How do you think about both the issue of energy access for countries that lack, stable, reliable power, and how do you think about these hydrocarbon producers that are, very, very dependent on that revenue stream? Like, how will they fare in an accelerated energy transition scenario?
I was in Algeria and in Libya last month, and this is exactly the kind of questions that we're discussing in those countries. And we have operations in Tanzania, Angola, Nigeria, and so forth. And it does feel like a tale of two worlds at the moment, that you've got one world heading off towards the greener future and another world that simply wants to come out of the coronavirus crisis and provide its population with a higher standard of living. And the two conversations don't meet often enough. I think there's a really important point here, which is trying to lower the emissions associated with fossil fuels. So trying to eliminate coal as a source of power in some countries, trying to reduce the amount of wood burning in sub-Saharan Africa. In Nigeria, trying to reduce the amount of power that comes from diesel generators. And these are often, for example, in Nigeria, in a country with abundant supplies of natural gas that could produce that power with a small fraction of the carbon footprint. So that's, I think, key. The third piece is that we need to remember that this is an energy transition, not an energy switch. We can't expect whole economies to flip from one to the other, regardless of the desires of their populations. We have to work with them on this journey. And I think a final part is making sure that we do lay the renewable foundations there in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, that we allow them to fast track through oil and gas in a way that allows them to reach renewable energy faster than the industrialized world has done so.
And can I just ask you one follow-up question before I turn to my friend Greg? Like, you mentioned natural gas. Like, what is the role of natural gas in this transition, particularly in developing nations, as you talked about, in places like Nigeria?
Well, we think
as that bridge fuel.
Absolutely. And we think it has a really big role. We're faced with such a crisis here that we need to use every single tool we have in the toolkit. And one of those tools, a big one of those tools, is that we can provide people with low-cost, reliable power for a fraction of the carbon footprint by moving from coal to natural gas. Now, it's not an end in itself. And we're very clear that the transition goes from coal to gas to blue hydrogen to green hydrogen over time. But in a crisis like the one we're facing, you can't just ignore the reality of that and have people carrying on the way they're producing energy at the moment with very high carbon emissions when you've got abundant supplies of natural gas that can dramatically reduce the emissions intensity of countries. So absolutely, we need to do that.
So Greg, I want to turn to you now on this issue because, again, not only are you such an important investor in both, conventional energy, renewable energy, you actually, you founded an NGO that deals with issues around refugees. And so I want to ask you, as you think about sort of both your hats as an energy investor and somebody who thinks about really these societal issues, how do you think about the issue of, countries like Nigeria and Venezuela and the Algerias in a sort of a rapid energy transition scenario? Like, how concerned are you about potential, strife in these nations if they cannot diversify fast enough? And then the issue around sort of energy access as well. Like, how do we think about countries that still lack access to stable, reliable power?
Well, thank you for connecting several topics that are dear to my heart. And Juliana mentioned climate refugees before. I kind of think about it as the burden share need not be equal for us to make progress. I think of it as that simple. We could do business better on a global basis. We can do climate better on a global basis. We can leapfrog with technologies and new technologies. The work that Juliana and Al are talking about offer opportunities, and they offer real opportunities. When you think about distributed generation and pairing them with renewables that are coming down in cost, think about the ability to lift the global south if they no longer have to depend on nation states to deliver the critical energy that they need to survive. And I think it actually, from a policymaker standpoint, is incredibly important, because if you look at like the populism and you look at the politics in places like Europe right now and the United States, they are not devoid or unassociated with the events that happened in the countries that were mentioned in Libya, for example, or Venezuela, and other areas in South and Central America, where you do have refugees, you do have migrants, and some of it is directly, for example, in Syria, related to climate. So I do think that these things all come together and really provide a very powerful force for us to motivate. And it's not all desperate and negative. There's opportunity in it. So when we think about investing, we look for companies that are going to be able to deliver these technologies. And if they can deliver them with an economic model in places like India, for example, that are viable, they have good policy supports, we want to be behind them. Now I have to be open-eyed about the fact that in a lot of places, a lot of these policies are only good for so long until they get reviewed. And particularly when the costs start escalating to the states, or it creates real risk for investors if there are policy reversals, and we can name them in almost every country throughout the world where you've had policies in place. So I think it is really important, though, if we can speak in one voice, have policy come together, that we could create a framework that can deliver better outcomes, even if the burden sharing is not equal. And I think the IMF last week had suggested different tiers in carbon prices. As I don't mean to go back to carbon prices, everything. We just think that that's a good way of allocating costs. It was not about parity. It was about lifting the global South, having the wealthier countries, have a higher burden share, and with that, hopefully funding more technologies that we can then help countries and people leapfrog and get off that coal. They don't have to have that as their first step. We can get to something better.
That's excellent. Now I'm going to take, I have literally so many questions. I'm going to start grouping them together, and I'm sorry if the way I group them is not necessarily seeming the most logical, but I'm getting many questions about sort of what are the expectations in terms of federal policy in the United States going forward. Like, what is the expectation we're having in terms of, what will actually get passed? What will we be seeing that'll be very important from the Biden administration? And then I'm getting questions about sort of how can the private sector become more involved in the transition? So Greg, I'm going to start with you since you're on the screen. You can pick one or both of those questions.
Wow. So I one of the things that I kind of want to bring up right now, because it's a little bit of a challenge, is one, when you look at like carbon offsets as a policy, that is one area where there's a lot of concern about greenwashing. So one thing I really encourage investors to do, to the standpoint that the question is, let's make sure we're investing our resources well and we are doing the best we can. There's no shortcuts here. I think that's what I want to emphasize. We have to take a very thoughtful approach about the investments we're making, the policies we're putting in place to make sure that we get the outcomes we want. We don't want to be investing in a carbon offset that doesn't materially and create real additionality in reducing carbons just to allow us to continue to step forward. So I think that's something that as investors, we really have to be responsible for, and making sure that that is something that we don't allow individuals or companies to use as a cover. What to expect from the Biden administration? It's obviously going to be more regulatory in nature. I do not think you're going to get a major congressional push to have a carbon prices or policy, but they are clearly looking at ways of supporting, whether it be through 45Q and other tax credits and complementary policies. Because that's one thing where they do have, like, emissions goals, or something that's being discussed right now for automobiles. That's effectively a carbon policy. It's an emissions policy. And as they look to, those are the sort of regulatory steps that I would expect them to continue to take as a way of fostering the climate change, even if they can't go out and do everything they would want to do otherwise, because it would require congressional steps.
Juliana, the question on to you again about sort of how can the private sector become more involved in the policies around the energy transition, and what are you thinking about is really meaningful from the federal government that you're looking to see enacted?
So, we have 70 companies that are very involved as partners of Greentown from the private sector. So there's a lot of involvement out there. And in many cases, it's not only about providing investment, but about trying these new technologies. I think what's more pressing instead of just the money is the possibility to test those new technologies in premises. So we are having not only these acceleration programs that I talked about that are corporate-led, but also these sort of pilot digest, where we kind of on a monthly basis try to put together what companies need to test their technologies to see if we can match the companies with some of our corporate partners. We need to make sure all these technologies get to wider use much, much faster because we have no time to lose. And I would say a little bit like Greg mentioned, sometimes companies are so eager to go to their net zero goals that they're doing it in the wrong way. It's not all about offsetting, with renewables. It's about looking at the way you generate greenhouse emissions in a holistic way. Sometimes when you put some innovation at some part of the innovation chain, you're only transferring those greenhouse emissions to other parts of the innovation chain. And sometimes it's even worse if you see everything on a holistic view. And that happens a lot with electric vehicles, for example, where most of the electric vehicles are actually manufactured in China with a very high carbon footprint. So if you check everything on a holistic way, you realize that maybe you're not offsetting that much carbon or as much as you thought you were. So one of the things that we do here in Houston is work with a lot of the technologies that are established there, but try to make sure that they work as efficiently as possible and in a very holistic way. And that's what we're trying to do with our corporates, to make sure that whatever that happens in terms of innovation is incorporated and doesn't, hinder somehow other parts of the chain. Regarding the Biden administration, I don't know if you saw, but about a month or 3 weeks ago, the Secretary of Energy came to Houston. That was her first trip out of DC. She made it to Houston and she made it to Greentown Labs. We had a great roundtable with key ecosystem players in the energy transition in Houston. And of course, that sent a very big sign. I think it's pretty important for the oil and gas capital of the world to transition and make sure that that transition happens. And it's not a switch like Al mentioned. But I think, one of the things that we're thinking about now is, there's all this great budget approved for making sure, we get to a cleaner transition. Several states have been allocated a certain amount of money. But when you start digging on how that money is going to be allocated, I don't think there's enough instruments out there to make sure the money is allocated efficiently. A lot of money goes to the state, but at some point I think it could be pretty good to have some new kind of instruments, like more akin to the venture capital, where instead of doing microloans like many of the initiatives that happen when you have money coming in from government programs, you can do something that is more efficient and is more aligned with everybody's interest. I think at this point, a lot of innovation needs quite a lot of capital. They are not at the microloan stage, and having instruments in every state where this money could be put to the best use would be kind of key.
So Al, I'm going to turn to you, but I'm actually going to switch the question a little bit for you because this has come in multiple ways as well. In terms of looking at the difference between where Europe is and where the United States is when it comes to energy companies. So one member of the audience asked, why do European companies seem to be, much more advanced in making some of these pledges? So I'd love to hear your perspective on that question.
Well, I think, we come from a country, Norway, that's had a high focus on the environment for 50 odd years. So we've been brought up in that way, conscious for the last half century. And I think one of the really positive things that's coming out of the US government at the moment is that the Atlantic Ocean feels much narrower in terms of energy policy than it sometimes has done. And we very much welcome the net zero pledges, the focus on reducing methane, fugitive emissions, the real focus on increasing the volumes of wind energy. And I think for companies on both sides of the Atlantic, just making sure that we close the gap between rhetoric and regulation is the key. So we've worked here as a member of the API and with a number of our partner companies here, and we see a real willingness to reduce emissions associated with oil and gas. If we can make sure we get the regulatory environment that incentivizes that. We see companies increasingly interested here in offshore wind, and would like to see more offshore wind rounds. Let's speed up the permitting of offshore wind on both coasts of the US. And we see a lot of enthusiasm as we build partnerships around clean hydrogen. And we would love to see the gap there between rhetoric and reality close, and to make sure that we can move forward at pace, that we can store carbon dioxide under the ground here, that we can build carbon dioxide pipelines, that we can really eliminate carbon dioxide. So making sure the regulatory environment comes in. I think if the government here does all of that, then we will see a very aligned approach between European and American companies.
Well, at the Atlantic Council, we love to hear that the ocean is shrinking. One final question, I'm gonna make it a lightning question because we only have a few minutes left. For so many years, we talked about all these issues around energy security and the geopolitics of oil and gas. I think about Dan Yergin's books. What's the one geopolitical issue that we may not be thinking about in terms of an energy transition? Is it access to critical minerals? Like, what do we need to be thinking about that the Atlantic Council will be discussing for multiple years about the transition? What is that issue that you think needs to be on our radar? Al, hot seat.
Very good. The one I would point to is the incredible global interconnectedness of supply chains. What on earth do I mean with all those long words? There's a really nice phrase out there that borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers. Borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers. And at a time when we've had a very nationalistic, nation-based approach to addressing the coronavirus pandemic, we need to remember that the future energy systems of the world are going to be incredibly dependent on technologies from different places around the world, projects from different places around the world, supply chains, minerals that come from one place, oil and gas that comes from another. And we need to make sure that we don't put up so many barriers between nation states that we eliminate the ability of the world to push together as one, supported by companies such as ourselves. So that's the one I'd point to.
Excellent. Juliana, lightning round question. What is the geopolitical issue that you think we need to focus on?
Yeah, so to me, and you know, following on Al, we have in Houston a lot of astronauts that are in advisory boards, and of course at Greentown Houston we also have an astronaut that is in our advisory board, Team Copra, and he talks about, you know, the perspective change and shift that happens to you when you go into space and you see this blue planet from space, and everything changes suddenly. It's like a realization, you know, and it never turns back, that, you know, borders don't exist. We all share the same planet. So to me, the big thing that needs to be top of mind on everybody is that if we want to solve climate change, it's going to be more a financial solution and making sure that the incentives are aligned than just technological, you know. So price of carbon, making sure that maybe we can pay from, like most developed countries, to stop deforestation of the Amazon, things like that, where, you know, we can actually do align and start incentivizing things that matter to us on a global basis instead of just in the US, are going to be key. And we need to be very mindful that, you know, depending on how we make those new financial systems, and I know that there's a big effort out there by many banks like Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, to create this Center for Financial Sustainability in New York. I think there's many ways we can achieve this, but without the new financial models that are going to promote this is not going to happen.
Greg, you're going to bring it home. Like, what is the geopolitical issue that you think we need to think about, the geopolitics of the energy transition?
Well, I think one of the big issues is that we're going to be, our actions in the world are going to react to climate change, and we are going to have to react to that. And I mean that from the standpoint of resiliency of our assets and the ability of us to have backups. Like, if you look at one of the projects that every insurance company has to be looking at, is like, what is a rising tide and sea levels mean to all the different insured assets we have? Fires, droughts, the Earth is going to find a lot of stress, and that's going to create geopolitical concerns that we are then going to have to react to. So the question is, can we create collaboration? Can we create cooperation? Can we sit there and anticipate as many of these as possible so that we have a game plan in place? Because I think in some respects, the world's changing and it's changing very quickly. And are we able to adapt to it and be ready to help those who need it and be able to respond to those crises as they develop? And I think it doesn't give you much necessary hope other than saying, let's plan. Let's take as many steps as possible to be ready.
Well, I think that is an outstanding way to bring this, fabulous conversation to a conclusion. I want to thank all of our participants today. I want to thank everyone from the audience who dialed in. And I want to just give a quick plug for an event that is taking place on July 6th. We will be having Crescent Petroleum CEO Majid Jafar and OPEC Secretary General Mohammed Sanusi Barkindo continuing this conversation on the road to net zero. So thank everyone for participating today. Have a wonderful afternoon.